Hello, everybody. Welcome. It is lovely to see you all here. We are so happy to have a nice full room. And I have to say, I'm so happy to see people I don't know here. So I'm Gabriella Safran. I'm in the Slavic department and in Jewish Studies. And it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Roni Masel. That is what I'm saying. So Roni is our neighbor from down the road. She teaches at Berkeley. She's an assistant professor, and she's the Norma and Sam Dabby Professor of Jewish Studies. She's a specialist in Yiddish with an undergraduate degree from Israel and a PhD from NYU. And she's writing a book now. She's completing a book manuscript with this great title, Bad Readers, Misreading, Mistranslation, and Other Textual Malpractices in Hebrew and Yiddish.
But this is not part of it.
But this is not part of it. She is also working on another project entitled Yiddish Empires, Visions of Race and the Global in Modern Yiddish Culture. And this is part of that. Yes, and she writes about a bunch of different topics, but one of them is Yiddish in South Africa, and an important topic that that I think we will all be happy to hear about. So, anything else I should say, or that's good?
No, that's excellent.
Okay, let us
Thank
welcome
you.
our guest.
Thank you. Whenever people say down the road, but then like you actually make the trip, and it's several roads, I have to say. And yeah, always a little longer than I expect it to be. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is really an exciting opportunity for me to present this project. I haven't had the opportunity really to do that in serious and with such a great audience. So thank you for inviting me. Um, yeah, so this is a part of a new project on trying to think about what happens to Yiddish outside of the beaten path, let's call it that way. There are the sort of expected geographies of where people turn to when they think about Yiddish or teach about Yiddish or do research on Yiddish, from generally Central to Eastern Europe, and then mostly to the US and sometimes other offshoots, and trying to figure out what taking in a different itinerary tells us about those various locales where Yiddish takes us, but also in what ways it can reflect back on the sort of more canonized versions of Yiddish culture that we know. So this is the general background. And I'm sorry for those of you on this row who will have to do a little bit of a neck stretch. Okay. So in my talk today, I want to share parts of my new project on the global circulation of Yiddish culture, literature, and philology, with a particular focus on Yiddish culture in South Africa. With this global itinerary in mind, I would like to begin with two quotes from speeches delivered in Yiddish at international conferences during the 1930s. This project centers mostly on the interwar period. And these speeches, these excerpts that I'm going to share, are in many ways characteristic of Yiddish culture in the interwar period, much more generally. The first was delivered in 1935 by Shmuel Leib Schneiderman at the International Literary Association, the annual conference of the Literary Association PEN. Schneiderman was sent there as a delegate of the Yiddish PEN Club, which was established just a few years earlier as part of an aspiration to claim a place for Yiddish literature on the global stage. The decision to include Yiddish in the PEN International wasn't an easy one, and several scholars of Yiddish have written about that. At the time, the organization was thinking about world literature as the sum total of recognized national literatures with clear territories or territorial aspirations. But Yiddish had neither a territory nor a claim to one, and instead the Yiddish writers who petitioned the establishment of a Yiddish pen club in the 1920s made an imaginative argument, which was that Yiddish's territory is the Yiddish language itself. So in his speech, Schneiderman echoes these arguments, and he's saying, "Colleagues and friends, speaking to you here is a citizen of the land of Yiddish, a land without barracks, without a military, a land in which the only weapon is the pen. You will not find this land on any atlas. The borders of this land exist only in the regions of cultural achievements and laborious artistic work. The citizen of the land of Yiddish is a citizen of the world. Everywhere on all continents, the colonies, he says colonias, of that Yiddish land are spread, and everywhere they struggle and wrestle with external as well as internal enemies. A similar view of the world and of the place of Yiddish within it appears in another speech by the celebrated Yiddish writer Yosef Opatoshu. Opatoshu's speech was the keynote address of yet another international conference, which sought to form a joint platform for Yiddish cultural activists and activities, particularly left-leaning and communists were particularly overrepresented in that conference from all around the world. And Opatoshu says, um, Yiddish is a Weltsprache. Yiddish is a world language because Jews are a world people. Although we have no army, no navy, no borders, we can say today more justifiably than the British that the sun truly never sets on Yiddishland. Yiddishland is on a higher degree than armies, borders, and passports, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, thousands, tens of thousands of cities and miles, oceans, forests, fields, where 24 hours a day one hears the sound of Yiddish, of our tongue, the tongue of the international Yiddish people or Jewish people. It says Yiddish folk. It's a bit ambiguous term, which believes in justice, which will annihilate hatred and animosity between men, between people and nations, between races. So, as in Schneiderman's remarks, here too, Apatoshu ties international leftist principles and resistance to territorial chauvinism, territorial nationalism, together with a view of a Yiddish world, or of a trans-territorial, particularist Yiddishland. The material reality behind these articulations is the aftermath of Jewish mass migration in the late 19th century from Eastern Europe, starting in the 1880s, to destinations the world over, including Western Europe and North America, as well as Latin America, Australia, South Africa, and the Middle East. But what we can see in this and in other similar Yiddish texts from the period is not simply a description of a geographic demographic phenomenon, meaning that Yiddish-speaking Jews are moving away from Eastern Europe and landing elsewhere in the world, that had been taking place in the preceding decades, but the emergence of an ideological and cultural agenda. That agenda builds on the global dispersal of Yiddish-speaking Jews to articulate a specifically universalist, progressive culture anchored in Jewish and Yiddish particularism. It envisions a world in which global Yiddish-speaking communities maintain strong ties to each other while forming leftist-oriented political and cultural alliances with their new neighbors in their new global homes. Now, these and similar articulations from the interwar period have recently been noted in scholarship as somehow emblematic of what's thought of as a Yiddishist, non-nationalist, non-territorialist, and still a particularist kind of identity and sensibility, a cultural agenda, celebrating Yiddish's worldliness as an exemplary case of how a minor culture can operate on the global stage. For instance, essays expressing similar ideas have found their ways into David Damrosch's very influential anthology, World Literature Today, from 2014, as a key example of a diasporic literature with a global reach. More recently, the term Yiddishland and other Yiddishist conceptualizations of the world beyond a nation state have gained popular traction in circles much wider than that of Yiddish enthusiasts, some of them are in this room, or literary critics. So you see here this very recent book by Molly Crabapple that articulates a similar version of the world with a particular kind of class struggle agenda, the Bundist, like a popular history of the Bund, with its diasporic vision of a global culture that's somehow also particularist, as well as another recent example in the Yiddishland Pavilion, so actually taking the term Yiddishland and using it to establish like an alternative pavilion, much like the alternative pen club of the 1920s. So we have an alternative pavilion for Jewish art under the title or the banner of Yiddishland at the Venice Biennial. While I remain sympathetic and myself committed to efforts of thinking the world beyond the epistemological and concrete confines of the nation state, What I would like to do today is complicate this universalist Yiddishist model to rethink critically our uses and configurations of transnational and diasporic modalities of telling global literary histories through the case of Yiddish in South Africa. So, in other words, the question is whether Yiddishist concepts indeed give us good, workable models, and if they do, what are some potential pitfalls that we should be mindful of as we take on these diasporic transnational models and try to apply them to contemporary um, problems that we're trying to work through. So the first thing we might want to consider is the global imaginary in Apatoshu's and Schneiderman's speeches. While both emphasize the abstract Yiddishland's lack of actual borders and armies, we should note the imperialist imaginative framework that organizes, in their mind, the spread of Yiddish-speaking and Yiddish-writing communities. So for Schneiderman, this is colonias, right? Colonies. He imagines um, these communities as colonies that share origins, contact, and networks with the Yiddish metropoles, namely the urban centers of Eastern Europe. And for Apatoshu, the spread of Yiddishland mimics that of the British Empire, and in fact, it not only mimics, but surpasses, right? Yiddish speakers can claim, says Apatoshu, more justifiably so than the British Empire, that the sun truly never sets on Yiddishland. So how should we understand this conceptualization of, this conceptualization of the world? How can we make sense of the competing forces and tendencies that such texts evince? On the one hand, an aspiration for universal justice and minority rights and resistance to nationalist chauvinism. And on the other hand, the surfacing of imperialist desires, or at least an imperial sense or frame of reference. This very ambiguity informs this project that I'm working on that thinks about how to conceptualize global Yiddish culture in the interwar period. If contemporary scholarship often turns to interwar Yiddish world thinking and world making as an alternative to the nation-state model of literary history, then we need to ask ourselves how that Yiddishist model landed, so to speak, in its various global locales at the time, and whether that Yiddishist model is indeed applicable for our purposes of configuring new ways of understanding literature, literary history, and culture in the world. So in order to give you a sense of how I think about these problems, for the main part of my talk, I want us to turn to Yiddish sources from South Africa, mostly from Johannesburg, sources that animate and illustrate the tensions that surround these Yiddishist conceptualizations of the world. In approaching these materials, I ask, what happens to core notions of interwar Yiddish culture in global circulation? What happens, for example, to markers of race, ethnicity, and the image of the world or of a Yiddish globe once these are transposed from one political reality, um, the Jewish centers of Eastern Europe, to another reality, and especially to a colonial reality, and under the wings of imperial enterprises. To borrow a phrase from Amir Mufti, the question is what happens to Yiddishland in the colony? What happens when certain worlds of thought or political and intellectual configurations, such as that of the abstract trans-territorial Yiddishland, what happens when they make their way to the colonized world? More profoundly, perhaps, this is also an opportunity to explore what this global itinerary might tell us, following Apatoshu's and Schneiderman's imperialist terminology, about modern Yiddish culture in the metropoles of its imperial imagination, meaning the big urban centers of Eastern Europe and North America. So let's turn to South Africa. I'll show you today just a few examples of what is in many ways a very odd or enigmatic phenomenon, and that is the case of leftist Yiddish writers who expressed cultural and political affinity to white Afrikaners and to Afrikaans cultural and political revival in the 1930s in South Africa, which is also to say at the very same moment when white Afrikaner nationalism and fascism more broadly were on the rise. A few notes on why this phenomenon is odd in the first place. So the Jewish community in South Africa favored as a whole a cultural, lingual, and political identification with the British from the earliest days of Jewish migration to the Cape Colony and throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And in fact, during the rule of the Dutch East India Company in the Cape Colony, Jews, alongside other non-Protestants, were prohibited from settling in the colony. And so only with the British annexation in 1806, and thus with the intensification of an inter-European colonial conflict there between the Afrikaners and the British, this is the moment where Jews actually arrive. So the Jewish community, which at first comprised mainly of Dutch, German, and English Jews, considered the British Empire as its political patronage and identified with it culturally and politically and linguistically. So they're mostly Anglophone. But the Johannesburg Yiddish Circle of the 1930s, on which I focus in this project, arrived as part of a much later migration wave of Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe, almost exclusively from Lithuania, who in the early 20th century were searching for ways to articulate their own political and cultural sensibilities in their new country. In contrast with the Anglophone loyalties of the local Jewish community, this group expressed a greater cultural and political affinity to the Afrikaners. And the question essentially is why? What political or cultural vision prompted them to do so? Um, so, the rise of anti-Jewish sentiments in 1930s South Africa certainly played an important role in that decision, with the hope that a shared cultural production could curtail or mitigate anti-Jewish animosity that was beginning to emerge there. But as is apparent from their writing, as we will see, this alignment with Afrikaner culture and politics is indebted to their broader worldview and particularly their interpretation, and I will argue today a misinterpretation, of the political reality in South Africa. Furthermore, while identification with Afrikaner culture and politics seems perhaps anomalous within the urban Jewish political patterns in South Africa, I wish to demonstrate today that it is well rooted in the logic of the emerging international Yiddish culture of the interwar period with which I started my talk today. So this vision of Yiddishland. The main group that I'll discuss is an organization that called itself the Yiddische Kulturverein, or the Yiddish Cultural Society. That organization's activity was relatively short-lived and lasted only a few years in the late 30s and the early 40s. By the establishment of apartheid in 48, it was already completely gone. Um, but as part of its activities, it published a monthly journal, the Philology. It established secular afternoon Yiddish schools for children, a Yiddish theater group, and what they called a humanistic college, which gave lecture series for adults on all sorts of Yiddish and general literature and philology and politics, Marxist history, Marxist critique, kind of lecture series. So as these activities reveal, and this you see here just a few of the title pages of the Philology, the journal. As these activities reveal, the organization was dedicated to core tenets of a generally leftist-oriented global Yiddish culture, and to the image of the world promoted by Opatoshu and Schneiderman, which is to form progressive Yiddish-speaking centers all over the world, which would maintain a strong commitment to universal justice and establish ties to local class struggle while being informed by Jewish and specifically Yiddish particularism. When it came to their interpretation of local class struggle, which was their goal and their search for potential political allies in the new country, the members of the Verein and the contributors to the Philology, the journal, imported their understanding of class and ethnicity from Eastern Europe and applied it onto the South African context. And what I mean by that is that in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, Yiddishist activists with populist or socialist sensibilities recognized the local rural population, the Slavic peasants, some of them only recently emancipated serfs, and many of them rapidly becoming urban proletarians, and saw in them their primary political partners in class struggle, championing minority rights and rejecting imperial interests. The late South African Yiddish scholar Joseph Sherman rightfully noted how the Yiddish writers in South Africa equated the Slavic peasants with the rural Afrikaner farmers, right? Also undergoing this transformation from impoverished farmers to impoverished proletarians, noting how both groups suffered economically as well as from cultural disparagement. Their vernaculars, meaning the Eastern European vernaculars, the Jewish vernacular, Yiddish, and the Afrikaner vernacular, Afrikaans, were suffering from cultural disparagement. Their vernaculars portrayed as corrupt dialects, unworthy of cultural and intellectual pursuits. And indeed, that equation between the Afrikaner farmers and the Slavic peasants brought the contributors of the Forois to express greater interest in in Afrikaner culture and politics. So throughout its run, a writer named Yankiv Mordechai Sherman, who was the uncle of Joseph Sherman, the Yiddish scholar, published translations from Afrikaans literature and essays on significant achievements of the Afrikaner cultural renaissance. So those included reviews of literary and intellectual publications in Afrikaans, essays on notable writers, etc. The translated short story that you see here by C.M. van der Heever belongs to a genre of pastoral Afrikaner fiction which flourished in the 1930s and is known as the Plaasroman, or the farm novel. This pastoral genre, depicting idyllic leisurely life on rural farms, served, according to J.M. Coetzee in his book Right Writing, to represent the Afrikaner farmer as maintaining a spiritual agrarian continuity, which in turn justifies Afrikaner land ownership while simultaneously erasing traces of actual Black labor on the farms. This kind of erasure is what is interesting for me, right? This kind of erasure, and significantly the translation of this erasure into Yiddish through the translation of the Afrikaner fiction, repeated itself over the pages of the Forois, and I will share just two more examples. So two main events in 1938 were particularly productive for the Forois in articulating its interest in forming closer affinities between Jews and Afrikaners. So first, 1938 marked the centenary of the Great Trek, which was the migration in the 1830s, 100 years earlier, of Dutch settlers from the Cape Colony, then recently annexed by the British, to the interior of the continent as a way to avoid the British colonial administration. The centenary celebrations in the 1930s, you can see some photos of those here, became a major force in the rising momentum of Afrikaner nationalism, in which the Great Trek was presented as an origin moment of Afrikaner nationhood. The Forois provided its readers with a historical background on the events and their meaning for contemporary Afrikaner culture, and published a short drama by the writer Rachmiel Feldman. This is an excerpt from it, which nostalgically describes the trekkers' idealism. At the same time, the short piece dramatizes a violent encounter between the trekkers and the Zulu, and it explains the violence as a result of epistemological differences between the two groups and their diverging conceptions of property law and ethics. It thus brings to the front a contentious moment between colonizers and natives, while also justifying the Afrikaner settler colonialist drive by alluding to the supposed fundamental inability to achieve universal justice because of cultural differences. Or in other words, if we don't have the same conception of what property is or what land is or what ownership is, then the theft is no theft, right? This is, a common feature of colonialist discourse or fiction. 1938 was also a year of general elections in South Africa. And that gave the Forois the opportunity to portray a broad view of the political map for its readers. Fitting for its general political inclinations, the journal dedicated significant space for discussing the platform of the Labour Party, and this is not surprising at all. What is surprising, however, is that they decided to dedicate similar space, so like 3 full journal openings, so they dedicated similar space to discussing another group, the Farmers and Workers Party, that you see the manifesto, the platform for it here, which was an entirely insignificant party, which did not even win enough votes to enter parliament. But what seems to attract the Forois to this party was that its platform tied together anti-imperialist sentiments together with a focus on what the platform called poor whiteism, meaning the impoverishment of the Afrikaner farmers and proletarians. And it called for the nationalization of natural resources from the hands of foreign imperial investors under the slogan, "The whole of the land for the whole of the people." This was part of an international movement with the same slogan called Georgism. Now, as conveyed in the Forois, that platform did not address questions of race at all. Thus, it suited perfectly the Foroice's interest in coming up with a localized interpretation of class struggle, meaning like what does Yiddish-supported local class struggle supposed to look like in South Africa? This is it: nationalizing of the resources, giving everyone the same. But it's crucial to note. Um, Coming up with a localized interpretation of class struggle while at the same time not implicating itself in right-wing Afrikaner nationalism. But it is crucial to note that the party's actual platform um, does sorry the party's actual platform does adhere to ideas of racial segregation, and it indicates no intention to share the riches of South Africa's natural resources with non-whites. The Voice's omission of that part of the platform illustrates its contributors' conflicted fascination with Afrikaner nationalism and its populist politics. So the actual platform suggests very specific ways of dividing resources between whites and non-whites, which includes complete segregation, um, and that part never was translated into the Yiddish version. Before moving to the last part of my talk, I want to briefly remind you what's at stake for us in looking at these materials. I started the talk by looking at visions of Yiddishland that created a sense of Yiddish internationalism and an interest in formulating a dialectic of local rootedness in the new global home, um, alongside a universal adherence to Yiddish culture and class consciousness. However, now having seen examples of what those aspirations actually looked like in South Africa, we have to rethink what happens to this global view in colonial settings. In our case, as the Johannesburg Yiddish Circle equated the oppressed Eastern European peasants with the rural white Afrikaners, and as they conceptualized their cultural, literary, and political program in the new country accordingly, they overlooked the Afrikaners' own role in the oppression of native South African blacks and appeased their uneasiness with racist Afrikaner nationalism by holding on to universalist sentiments, and in this context, entirely misleading sentiments, such as the whole of the land to the whole of the people, right? The platform has no interest in the whole of the people. They thereby misrepresented, as they possibly misinterpreted, the profoundly different conditions and racialized divisions in South Africa. But in the time that I have left, I turn to an essay that actually started this whole rabbit hole that I got into Yiddish culture in South Africa. And this is an essay by Yankel Mordechai Sherman, who I mentioned before, the uncle of Joseph Sherman, who was translating a lot of Afrikaans fiction and poetry in the Foroise. This essay was published in 1936 by the Verein, and in this essay, which is titled Die Afrikaans Sprache und Literatur, or Afrikaans Language and Literature, Sherman sought to form closer familiarity between Jews and Afrikaners, as he writes in the following quote. He says, "Philologically speaking, Afrikaans is a sister language of Yiddish. Both share their roots in Dutch and in German. I believe, therefore, that not only is it not difficult, but that it is also absolutely necessary that Jews will acquaint themselves with Afrikaans language and culture. This will bring to a rapprochement or approchement, an understanding, a friendly relationship between Jew and Boer, which is utterly essential." And throughout the essay, Sherman tells his readers of the long struggle for Afrikaans self-determination as a language and a culture appropriate for intellectual endeavors. And he constantly compares it to the struggle of Yiddish writers in the 19th century to claim Yiddish as a legitimate language and not a despised jargon, which is a common pejorative for Yiddish throughout the 19th century, thus creating a familiar intimacy between the Yiddish readers of this pamphlet and Afrikaans as a language and a culture. Sherman draws further parallels by describing itinerant Afrikaans teachers as melamdim, which is a way for him to use the Hebraic component in Yiddish that alludes specifically to kind of Jewish intimacy. Instead of, he could have used the German alternative, the Germanic alternative, lerels, but instead he uses the Hebraic one that indicates clear parallel between Jewish education and Afrikaner. He then compares the tension between Afrikaans in Dutch to that between Yiddish and Hebrew, so the vernacular versus the high language, both vernaculars being humiliated and described as the higher language's maidservant or dienst. Um, so again, sort of bringing the Afrikaner, the Afrikaans experience into the frame of reference that's articulated in very intimate terms, in ways that Yiddish only secures for describing things that are intimately familiar and Jewish. Finally, he calls Afrikaans Mameloschen, which literally means mother tongue, but it's used, especially in the 20th century, almost exclusively as a like a pet name for or an intimate name for Yiddish. So beyond Sherman's insistence on the similarities between Yiddish and Afrikaans in terms of their history of struggle for recognition, I find to be particularly interesting his reliance in the quote above on the racial familial connection between Yiddish and Afrikaans, right? So his argument is that since both languages share Germanic origins, or components, Sherman calls them sisters, and in so doing, he follows the foundational metaphor that informs philological discourse in the 19th century and early 20th century, which discusses relations between languages in terms of familial kinship and a racial taxonomy. Similar ideas about Yiddish philology and the familial intimacy between Yiddish and Afrikaans were reiterated a year later by a writer named Label Feldman, who was Rachmiel Feldman's brother. They're all related, so I have like a parallel genealogical project to this, tracing the familial relationships between all these people. Um, so Label Feldman, who was a communist, a devout communist, albeit a very wealthy businessman, um, also dabbled in writing popular books on Jewish history in South Africa. And alongside his philological notes, he criticizes the Jews' opportunistic alignment with the British, betraying the warm Afrikaner hospitality extended to them in their early days in the country. And curiously, he describes that Afrikaner welcome as a naively romantic girl who throws herself at a man, the Jew that is, yet the man wryly replies, I have a wife and children, a home. I did not come here to fall in love or to be loved. I came here to sell and buy goods, right? So conceptualizing the relationship between Jews and Afrikaners through notions of romance, Feldman argues that the Jews missed the opportunity to love and be loved when they turned their backs on the Afrikaners and instead looked up to the British, who viewed them in turn as, and this is another quote from his piece, that the British viewed them as a ghettoized, uncultured Oriental types. And the question is, why do Sherman and Feldman choose to narrate this relationship between Jews and Afrikaners through the metaphors of family and romance? In asking this, I would like to recall that in colonial contexts, love and kinship are a very dangerous thing. Um, that imperial regimes always seek to govern the relationships between different groups under their control, and for that reason they construct an effective terminology, often an eroticized terminology, which defines intimacy and filiation between neighbors, as it were, as dangerous. And I'm thinking here with already classical work on imperialism and colonial discourse, such as that of Ann Stoller or Jenny Sharp or Anne McClintock. So while telling a love story or a family saga between Jews and Afrikaners, I want to remain vigilant and cautious about, for instance, what love stories reveal about constructions of race or about the collective demarcations they imply, about who is excluded from that romance, or in other words, about the narratives of hate that love stories aim to conceal. So Feldman's and Sherman's choice to focus on Yiddish philology and discuss its intimacy with Afrikaans in eroticized and familial terms, in terms of kinship, is important to me because of the centrality of the racial imagination in philological discourse, pervasive in Yiddish in the early 20th century, and because of the centrality of philology and philological linguistic thinking and metaphors in all movements that sought to establish a Jewish cultural and ideological agenda that was based on Yiddish. Um, including and even especially under the sign or vision of the International Yiddishland. So, for example, the Yiddishists among us in the room may recall Bel Borochov's formative essay on Yiddish philology from 1913. I don't have the time to get into that essay in detail, but I would like to mention that one of its most striking intellectual moves is when Borochov rejects the racial imaginary of philology uh, of Yiddish, right? Arguing for an honorable status for Yiddish, not as a bastardized racial hybrid, mixing Hebraic and Germanic and Slavic components, but instead as a legitimate national language. But at the very same time, however, Borochov uses the very same racializing logic of philology, which he had previously used, which had been previously used to dismiss Yiddish as a useless and corrupt jargon, and this time Borochov is using that discourse in order to argue for the preservation of Yiddish's newly found purity, and I can get in the Q&A into how he does that. It's an interesting move. But this ambiguity towards the racial imaginary of philology, arguing against it and simultaneously championing it as in an effort to claim an honorable place for Yiddish, emerges throughout philological writing in Yiddish from Borochov and onwards in linguistic enterprises from the interwar and postwar periods. Sherman's invocation of the Yiddish philological discourse in the 1930s South Africa in an attempt to draw Jews and Afrikaners closer together is another such stop in this global itinerary of Yiddish philology and its ambiguous usage of racial imaginary. This global itinerary of Yiddish philology brings to mind how within European linguistic discourse and within the European racial imagination and political reality, Yiddish-speaking Jews were the objects of racializing and colonizing discourses. They inhabited a minority position of an unassimilable ethnic group marked by theological difference within a geopolitical area, Eastern Europe, that is, that's already being discussed in orientalizing and colonizing terms. But what the focus on South Africa reveals to us is the process by which Yiddish and its speakers and writers turned from colonized objects to colonizing subjects. This shift requires of us to rethink what happens to markers of race once they are transposed from Eastern Europe to South Africa. For example, how should we make sense of such depictions of Yiddish and Afrikaans as sister languages or as sharing familial racial intimacy when they are produced in a place where such a categorization of kinship holds very concrete legal implications under a regime of racial segregation? Before concluding, I wish to briefly share an anecdote that would illustrate the gravity of this question. So in 1902, the Cape Province Assembly drafted a new bill whose goal was to limit the immigration of undesirable population. This was the term they used. And they defined desirable immigrants as those who could read and write in a European language. And since Yiddish is written in the Hebrew alphabet, not only would have Eastern European Jewish immigrants been refused admission once the law passed, but such a categorization could alter Jews' racial definitions within the colonial administration at large. So meaning this could change the racial status of Jews already in the country. So a journalist and Yiddish language enthusiast and a very weird person named David Goldblatt submitted a pamphlet to the Cape Assembly in which he relied on philological concepts to define Yiddish as a European language. So you see that plea on the left. And along with strong advocacy by the established Jewish community in South Africa, the Assembly finally accepted his bid and declared Yiddish a European language in 1906. And incidentally and curiously, perhaps, this is also the first parliament in the world ever, anywhere, to declare Yiddish as a language and not a dialect. But they declare it a European language following this philological essay that he submitted. Now, this instance highlights the political implications of the racial philological imagination and its uses. In Eastern Europe, discussions over how to define Yiddish, how to revive it, and build a movement of cultural and political revival based on Yiddish were an attempt by a marginalized ethnic minority to achieve a cultural autonomy and greater liberties. Yet in South Africa, these same ideas and that same kind of cultural advocacy and cultural activism carry the implications of realpolitik, where one's language and its racial categorization hold a very concrete implications for one's political status within a racial taxonomy of privileges, violence, and discrimination. So to conclude, I want to turn to thoughts with which I opened today about global Yiddishland and its politics, about Yiddish transnationalism, about the desire to narrate global literary histories. The case of the Johannesburg Yiddish Circle and its romance with Afrikaans culture and politics in 1930s. Johannesburg stands at the very margins of South African history, of Jewish history, and even of South African Jewish history. This is a really tiny circle of people, in many ways very insignificant. Yet it belongs at the very heart and center of a globalizing Yiddish cultural ideology of its time. And it therefore gives us an opportunity to reflect back on major trends of interwar Yiddish culture. The story turns our attention to the imperialist epistemological impetus that guided the international Yiddishist drive to globally apply its political cultural theory, a theory born out of particular historical conditions in Eastern Europe. And as Yiddish-speaking Jews encountered new neighbors in South Africa, that application of their Eastern European understanding of class and ethnicity resulted in a willful political blindness to the racialized divisions in South Africa. I suggest, therefore, that we look at the Johannesburg Yiddish Circle as a cautionary tale for those of us interested in modalities of global histories, or of world literature or diasporic literary networks. This is a cautionary tale that should urge us to pay a close attention to the great benefits of assuming a global perspective in writing Jewish history on the one hand, as well as to the thing we might lose track of in a global view of Yiddish culture or in a global view of any culture for that matter, to the distortions that occur in global migrations. It should urge us finally to account for the particularities of the colonial conditions rather than champion global Yiddishland as an emblem of utopian transnationalism. Thank you.
I believe our speaker will entertain questions.
Yeah.
And first of all, this was fascinating. Thank you so much. And little Anna comes from Stanford.
Yes.
For many years, Yiddish was part of African and Middle Eastern languages here. So now I understand why, because until now I had no idea. But seriously, I think that you bring in a very interesting question about whether something can be global in general. Because the more you talked about it, the more local it seemed. Either local in terms of where is the place that you are longing to, or that you connect to yourself, versus, to what extent you become part of the local space. And so many questions. So it just brings such interesting question of the ability of something to even be global, because part of being is being in a place, at a certain time. So I thought that was really interesting. And the other thing that was interesting for me in the relationship between the man and the love story is that suddenly Yiddish turned into a man. Yeah, usually Yiddish is the woman, right? So what is happening there? And that was kind of a small question for you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll start with the first, or actually no, with the second. That's a great question. I need to think about it. It's really interesting what's going on there. Why is it that in his imagination, I mean, part of it is like the historical reality of Jewish immigration to South Africa is that somewhat unlike the Jewish immigration to North America, it really was more of the typical work migration. So mostly men traveled at first, and it was only much later that women arrived, which wasn't really the case for the kind of New York version of that story. But I mean, just in terms of figuration, it's really interesting what goes on there, and what that serves as this transformation of the philological gendered imagination of Yiddish. On the first point, I mean, yes, like I'm not obviously not the first to note that. I'm thinking a lot with even like Said's traveling theory, right? There is a problem that whenever you try to apply a generalizing theory on a specific location, it's always going to fail. There's always these like hiccups. Um, and so the question is like, what do we need to do? Is it a question of modification, that in every case that we encounter, we modify the theory that we're working with to understand something about the location, or is there something that's wrong about the theory in general? Um, and I'm not sure that I have an answer for that. And I'm also, as I said also at the beginning of the talk, I'm very sympathetic to the effort to try to imagine a way of understanding the world or telling a story of the world that's not bound by the configurations of nation states. But the question is also what we stand to lose with that. So, for instance, when Apotoshu says Yiddishland has no armies, no borders, no passports, and he says that in 1937. I mean, of course, then the fact that these Yiddish writers don't have passports also mean that they die 5 years later, right? So um, there's something um, to try to really ethically um, contend with those questions of diaspora, of nation states, what to do, how to understand the world, how to come up with alternatives, how to portray a view of the world that looks differently. You have to also always account for the very material reality that you're trying to fit into the into the to the new framework, right? So if you're leaving people stateless, that's not a solution. If you're not paying attention to the fact that your view of ethnicity and class doesn't fit when you look at a colonial reality um, where Black labor and non-white labor is like is a form of violence and extraction and dispossession. So yeah, basically, I don't have an answer. But,
So, given the diversity of opinions that often obtains in Jewish communities, I wonder if you found any glimmer of any dissenters who didn't buy into the colonizers' racism, or who said, well, wait, maybe we should be attending a little bit to the conditions of the blacks, or was that completely absent?
I mean, so yes, obviously. These people are really marginal in many ways. So the majority of the Yiddish press in South Africa is, first of all, commercial and not at all sort of attached to this vision of like, let's fix the world through Yiddish culture. They are mostly Zionists, which those folks are not, even as late as the 30s. And beyond that, I mean, yes, of course, the community there is like very diverse in its opinions and its lingual identifications. And another important thing to say is that these all of these figures that I relate to and their coworkers at the Journal and elsewhere constantly articulate anti-racist ideology. Yes, they clearly say like the dispossession of Black populations is unjustifiable. It's wrong. This shouldn't be the case. And at the same time, they don't see any contradiction between articulating that and also saying, oh, look at this really interesting phenomenon of these like Afrikaners. They're like our, Ukrainian neighbors. They're just the same. And they're fighting a colonial regime, meaning the British colonial and not the settler colonial Afrikaner movement. So they somehow don't grasp the fact that the two are in contradiction. Um, and I think that it's also interesting to note that these folks who are, yeah, all members of like either the Communist Party or um, somehow aligning that, um, they become and their children become important figures in the anti-apartheid struggle, right? Um, but it seems to me that there is, and I'm saying that also relying on memoirs of um, Levi, what's his first name? Very important anti-apartheid activist, I'm blanking on his first name, who wrote in his memoirs about his parents and his parents belonging to that circle, right? And it seems from what he's saying that that experience somehow created a kind of crisis, ideological, conceptual crisis, where those leftist Jews realize that they can no longer try to articulate their lefty commitments, their leftist commitment, their anti-racist commitments with their Jewish commitments, that the two were somehow different things, that they were Jews and they were also activists against the apartheid, but they were no longer trying to articulate those two as somehow related to each other. And it seems to me that there might be a generational, personal history to that. That the children of these folks were like, wait, this model doesn't work. We need to figure out a new way. Yeah.
Yeah, sort of as an addendum to this, mostly it seems like they're not talking about the Black population of South Africa as opposed to talking about it in like political terms.
Yes.
Are they using this philological approach at all to talk about Zulu? Like, is that occurring at all? Or are they comparing local languages, like African languages, with Afrikaans or Yiddish at all?
So at first, not at all. I mean, um, so you're right. They're basically mostly not saying anything positive. They say, racist violence is terrible. They say, dispossession is terrible, but they don't say anything, to indicate any actual familiarity. Even more so, the editor of the newspaper repeatedly writes these short essays in the international Yiddish press, most importantly in the Literarische Blätter, which is basically the most important interwar Yiddish journal published in Eastern Europe. And he says there at one point, Yiddish, we have to create our own localized version of what a South African Yiddish literature is. We cannot be based on the Polish models. See, this is what happened to the British, because the British are always indebted to the metropole, to Britain. This is why they could never create a local version of what English literature in South Africa is, and only the Afrikaners who are really rooted here, they are the only people who have a local literature that's like real. And then, like, as an offhand, he says, like, and the Africans, the Black Africans are, he says the word kulturlos. They don't have any culture, so we can't speak about the culture that they have or don't have, or what it is. So it's very minimal in the early years, in the 20s and 30s. Later it changes. So Rachmiel Feldman, the brother who wrote the play about the Trek, the Great Trek, then later becomes a local representative in one of the like a local municipality. He becomes very, very involved in labor activism, and through that he gets sort of firsthand familiarity with the experience of Black laborers, especially in the mines, and he writes quite a lot about that. There's a grad student at Toronto's writing about those stories, Caleb Scher. These are really interesting materials, but it develops a little later, so in the late 40s and then onwards.
One is a comment following on the last two comments, and then a separate question. When you were talking about the failure of the Yiddish translation to include the apartheid racial-based things, might that be an example of the discomfort of the people who were doing it, realizing it wasn't going to sell to the common people, and they could just leave this out? It wasn't an intellectually satisfying solution, but it was a recognition that of discomfort with the racial-based aspects. And in that sense, it can almost be seen as I don't want to say progressive element, but a shade of progressivism in terms of not getting into the racial issue. So that's just my comment about that. My question to you, if you have any thought about that, I'd be interested. My more general question is, I've never heard anything about Yiddish in South Africa, and know less than nothing about it. But I do know something about Yiddish in the world generally, and I imagine this is true in South Africa, that the big issue for people who were identified Yiddishists and Yiddish speakers was that the language was disappearing, and that it was not a viable, these people who were writing in the Yiddishing in 1930s, their children in the 1960s were not reading it, for the most part, in Yiddish and not speaking Yiddish. And therefore, what you're identifying as the racial aspects here is really a kind of survival. That how are we going to survive, and that as people feel more and more threatened in their identity, they feel, despite having an intellectual commitment to idealism and globalism and internationalism and all the rest of it, when the rubber meets the road, we're not going to have a Jewish community anymore. And that makes me feel more racially identified.
Yeah, that's great. I think on your first question, you use the word discomfort, and I think that that's exactly right. That's really the best word that I could find for this. They were really deeply unsure of what was going on, and they, as I said, had this like dual commitments that they couldn't reconcile, and whenever the two came to a head, even their very language and the way that they write sort of begins to disintegrate. These like very long sentences. That sentence with the Kulturlos, it's like I think a paragraph long. It's like unable to really come to any sort of understanding of how he's going to define what's going on here. Discomfort is a very good word, right? And then the question is, so if you're so uncomfortable with that, then why are you still pushing that ahead? I think that your suggestion that I think more about how that program fits into their worries about Yiddish in general, I think that that's a very interesting proposition. Um, so there's something that's very attractive to them in Afrikaans because of Afrikaans's kind of like longevity. So even though the Dutch settlers arrive so many, many, many generations earlier, they maintain their ancestral language and write in that ancestral language and even create a sort of like cultural renaissance in that ancestral language, and they don't assimilate linguistically into the British nor do they sort of go native and use local African languages. So there's something to the Yiddishists that Afrikaans models, like this dream of, yes, there might be like a long-lasting situation, and maybe we could, if we modeled ourselves on the Afrikaner model, then maybe our children will go to the Yiddish schools and will write in Yiddish, even though writing in English is much more appealing to them for like, economic prosperity or something. So I think that that's, um, I think that you're right, probably that it is a part of those concerns. They don't articulate that clearly, but it is implied, right? That concern for Yiddish's longevity. Um, yeah, so this is part of the pull.
Hi, thank you for introducing us to this really interesting topic, which I also know nothing about. And I was wondering if you could speak about the discourse in Afrikaans about Yiddish, if there was any. Was there an awareness of Yiddish speakers associating themselves with Afrikaans?
I mean, this is the most puzzling part of this project, is that I've been working a little bit. I mean, my Afrikaans is minimal, but I've sought help and have been looking for any sort of, is this a one-sided romance? And it kind of seems like it is. So the Afrikaners have no interest in Yiddish for obvious reasons. They do have immense fascination with Hebrew. um, for religious reasons, and they have a self um, imagination as kind of like origin of Afrikanerdom as being like somehow like a genesis moment. They're walking this barren, empty land, and they're like Abraham or something, right? So the Hebrew Bible with their Protestantism like really is uh, very central as a um, cultural lingual figuration, but Yiddish is not. Haven't been able. I might still find any resonances, but I haven't yet.
Thanks. Yeah, I also really enjoyed it. I was wondering, like, on the sort of imperial imaginations that you were talking about, do they ever mention like South African communities, like in South Africa? Do they see them? Because that's another sort of it's got an imperial, religious, like rootless, cosmopolitan. Like there's another whole kind of genealogy there. I mean, do they see like, oh, they're trying the same thing as us, like?
You mean the
South Asian.
Oh, South Asian, yeah. Well, they're really anxious about that actually, because that Undesirable Immigrants Act was targeted at South Asian immigrants. So they're incredibly anxious about that. They're incredibly anxious as being somehow uh, categorized in the same. I mean, Label Feldman, um, writes about that very, very clearly about the fear of being defined Asiatic, and because of the Hebrew alphabet. Um, so they, so I mean, yeah, obviously there are there are clear similarities in the actual like historical experience of these communities. But yeah, they sort of like keep a very, very clear distance from ever being like represented as because of the fear of the racial categorization. Yeah.
So what I've heard you present is a case study in terms of Yiddish land and imperialism in this time frame. Have you looked at other examples of imperial outposts of Yiddish land? I mean, I could name a few, but one that comes to mind is French Canada, or even though it wasn't technically under colonial rule, economic colonies like Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil, and then also to take that even further, how this is something I've looked at, how visitors from the New York metropole who originated in Eastern Europe, how they perceive these places when they visit through the lens of the North American metropole, but also, further back, what they brought with them 30, 40 years earlier from Eastern Europe. I mean, there are cycles within cycles here.
Yeah. Yes. So I haven't really looked at any primary sources from these. I have been thinking a lot with secondary sources, with people working on. I've spoken a lot with Rebecca Margolis, and folks working on Latin America. And what I do or have done is looking at comparatively at that genre of the correspondent. So what these Yiddish writers who are in South Africa writing to the international Yiddish press, especially the Literarische Blätter, but also elsewhere, and how folks on these international platforms, how they describe the South African case in relationship to these other outposts. I think it's interesting because they constantly try to reconcile, to say, oh, this is just one more case like this, transnational model that we have. What is the transnational model that we have? Is that Yiddish is somehow anchored in these specific centers, but it has its outposts, and Yiddish speakers speak Yiddish all over the world, and everywhere they have the same cultural agenda, but also there are some clear articulations of uneasiness with the particular brutalities of the South African case in comparison with the Canadian or the Latin American ones. I had something else that I wanted to say, but now it's and there are also these so Schneiderman interestingly arrives in South Africa. He in 39 he flees I think Poland. Nancy Sinkoff was writing a book about him, and he arrives in South Africa basically because that was the only place he could get a visa to, and he was hired there to work as the editor of other Yiddish journals who were like very commercially oriented and not at all like intellectual or doing anything whatever. He spent 6 months there, and then he like makes a run for it and arrives, I think, at first somewhere in Central America and eventually in New York. And a lot of these folks, so Charlash, who was the editor of the Philology, ends up in New York in 48. Peretz Hirschbein visits there in the 20s. Shalom Schwarzbald visits South Africa on his tour of fundraising for the encyclopedia. So there are all these like and he also dies. Shalom Schwarzbald dies in South Africa. I think I have it here. And no, he dies, and then they make a face mask of him. That and the face mask is then printed on the cover page of the Voice, but next to an African mask. Anyways, the whole it's very like bizarre things going on. So they are in constant relationships, in constant correspondence and conversation with Yiddish cultural activism all over the world. And what I try to do is figure out, exactly how it lands, right? And how visitors from Europe or from Poland and from America, what happens, how they view it when they arrive, and also how the reporting of these local South African Yiddish speakers, Yiddish writers, what happens when they publish in the international press and how that's received. It's a mixed bag.
Thank you. This was great. I have two questions. One that kind of builds off your last answer, which is I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about your particular model and understanding of center and periphery. As I understand it, it's the way you were using that term at the beginning, that the center is the main places in which Yiddish is theorized, the center of transnational Yiddishism, in which case Eastern Europe, but also New York. And so what would occupy the role of periphery? Because you end up in these kind of potentially ironic situations where something like London is the center of political empire for this, but also a peripheral site for the Yiddishland inhabitants who live there and are perhaps then drawn in different directions. So that's the first question, is just to describe a little bit more your framing. Yeah. And then the second builds off of something that Shelley touched upon earlier, which is this question of proportionality. Mm-hmm. When we're focusing on the marginal and the marginal of the marginal, what elements of the broader story are we actually losing? Mm-hmm. So if this, I appreciate this effort to kind of look back into and bring some historicism into the kind of transnational Yiddish project at a moment in which it's being celebrated. But in terms of a practical politics, we're talking about something that's deep down the list in the 1930s when these things are being published. You already mentioned Zionism. We would have had a Yiddish territorialism. We would have had communism and the allegiance to a Soviet state as a very big focus here. So just how do we balance the story we want to tell against the dominant trends that are occurring?
Not to mention Hitler.
Yeah.
Great questions. I think that the reason I'm interested in it is because even though you're right that this is a project that was way down the list, it is currently celebrated as something that's somehow a model for the present, which I'm not going to say it's not. It might be. I don't know. I'm trying to test it out, right? And to ask, what could be things that we're kind of not thinking about. What are just the potential costs of coming up with a globalized theory, as Ved is rightfully asking, like in in general, what are the possibilities for that? And I remain skeptical that we're able to come up with something that's like a true or absolute like solution um, that would be universally applicable and universally productive. Um, so this is for the second question, but I also had right. You're saying this is a marginal story in a marginal story of a marginal political program at the time. It's true. I would say that, as I said, it's marginal in the context of South Africa, but it's not marginal. I mean, this is the main program, cultural and political, of the Literarische Blätter. Um, and um, and so it is very central to the key platforms in which Yiddish culture is being articulated with sort of like intentional program in the interwar period that is key to that understanding of the world. And so in that sense, it's important. And for that sense, it's also became important, and it makes sense that it did, right? In writings like Alison Schechter's and Nita Levy's, that it makes sense that it's central also for their conceptualization of what a Yiddish in the world looks like, what a minor literature in the world looks like. This was part of their understanding of what Yiddish should be or could be. On the first, yeah, I don't know what's center and what's periphery. I think maybe I'm thinking about it in like naively, like numerical terms. I don't really know what's central and what's periphery. I'm picking up their terms, right? They're viewing themselves as peripheral to a center that's to two centers, even though, of course, there are three, right? The Soviet Union. And it's interesting because they're all communists, but they're not necessarily thinking about the Soviet Union as an important place for cultural production, even as Leibel Feldman is writing in the Soviet orthography. So it's it's yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, Scheire, yeah. um, so yes, so to say that it, I possibly need to think more about how I not necessarily mirror their vocabulary, but come up with my own. But I think that the reason that it becomes problematic is because precisely because of the problem that I'm trying to flesh out here, right? That they are thinking a world, thinking their location in it in ambivalent ways and in ways that never fully make sense when you apply them locally. Yeah, I think that would be my answer. Thank you.
Questions? Okay, maybe I'll ask one. I have a lot, but I'll ask just one. I'm I'm wondering. I love all these questions about, and your questions about. Okay, we don't want to tell a kind of reductive or oversimplifying global story. We want to tell a global story, and the Yiddish sources are very eagerly urging us to tell a global story about them, and they have a global story to tell about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we and they're communists, so of course they want us to tell a global story,
Right.
and we want to see, okay, can we tell a global story? What and does it hold together, or is it a bunch of little stories? And I'm wondering if maybe a theme that would let you unify some of the stories would be the theme of kind of allyship and error. Like you're interested in them thinking they found these allies in the Afrikaners and saying that's a mistake. Um, I just happened to read and review Gil Reebok's
Oh yeah.
recent
Mhm.
book
Yeah.
about African Americans in American Yiddish culture. So it's not as crude creatures, and then there's some very long next part of the title.
Mhm.
And his argument is something like, it's not unlike your argument, right? His argument is we Yiddishists today may celebrate, as Amelia Glazer's book does, the kind of global view of Yiddish and its of Yiddish poetry, especially very, very left-wing Yiddish poetry, which sort of seeks and finds um, uh, allies or kind of models for itself everywhere around the world in all oppressed peoples. But if you look at kind of one brow level lower, not at highbrow poetry, but at just like lowbrow stuff that people write in Yiddish, what you see is a really ambivalent attitude of American Yiddish writers toward African Americans, and sympathetic, but also very derogatory, especially before the 20s, and then much more sympathetic with them in the 20s, with the rise of the Klan and sort of this very violent rise of anti-Semitism, where the American Yiddish writers are like, oh, suddenly we really, really are sympathetic and understand the situation of African Americans, and we'll write about that a lot. So I'm wondering whether maybe a way to think about some tools you can use for your global story would be to think more uh, powerfully, more sort of explicitly about brow level, like what does highbrow left-wing Yiddish culture do versus maybe lower brow Yiddish culture, and also to think about this question of who are the Russian peasants. If you start out by saying this idea that the Faroese people have that the Afrikaners are Russian peasants is weird. They're not Russian peasants. And why would
interesting?
the idea of the Russian peasants being their allies anyway is funny. And then Gilbert Bach's argument is
Exactly.
the Yiddish writers, the kind of lowbrow Yiddish writers in the U.S. see African Americans as Russian peasants and thus kind of not their allies, as like these are precisely our like counterparts that we are sort of hostile to, and they're probably hostile to us, right? But of course, no one is actually only the Russian peasants are Russian peasants. So like that's like part of the issue too.
I'm thinking a lot with Gilles Rybak's project as like a counterexample, as well as the Latin American cases, and I think, well, first there's a temporal gap here because that analogy, right, of African Americans are like the Slavic peasants, therefore, is happens earlier, and this is in the 30s. So there's some gap by that point in the U.S. They're already thinking about race in different ways, but yeah, I mean, this is part of what's so interesting to me. Yeah, that at every place that these immigrants arrive, they come up with a different interpretation of what's going on. They come with these um, uh, paradigmatic narratives about culture and class and politics and race, and then they try to find out how to arrange those archetypical categories onto their specific location, and it's interesting how they do it so differently in various places, and I think, but this highlights also the benefits of trying to tell a global story, right? So I'm sort of constantly torn between the desire to say, well, wait, when we actually look comparatively across the globe, we learn really interesting things. But also, if you always have like a global view in mind, you're like bound to stumble into pitfalls you didn't foresee. So this is like my push and pull on this, but this is really helpful. To try to anchor it in a specific theme or other ways of organizing.
It's kind of nice that they're making mistakes, similarly to the little text about the Afrikaners as making this mistake, and that they think the Jews are going to fall in love with them, but no, they've just come to buy it. So mistakes everywhere.
Mistakes, yes, mistakes everywhere.
Mistakes. Any last questions? No, let us thank Roni.
Thank you. And thank you for all these really generative questions.